Margaret Chen had lived in the same little house on Maple Street for 52 years. The house wasn't fancy. The paint was peeling in some spots, and the front porch creaked when you walked on it. But inside, in the corner of her living room, sat something precious. An old upright piano, dark wood, scratched and worn from decades of use. Every morning, Margaret would sit at that piano bench with her cup of tea and play. Sometimes she played hymns from church. Sometimes she played songs from old movies. And sometimes she played pieces she'd written herself. Nobody really heard these songs except her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who liked to nap on top of the piano while she played. Margaret was 78 years old now. Her fingers weren't as quick as they used to be. Her back got stiff if she sat too long, but when she played, something magical happened. The aches and pains seemed to fade away. For those few minutes every morning, she was young again. Her granddaughter, Lily, visited every Sunday for lunch. Lily was 23 and worked at a coffee shop in the city, about 40 minutes away. She loved hearing her grandmother play. While Margaret cooked Sunday dinner, Lily would always say, "Grandma, play me something before we eat," and Margaret would smile, wipe her hands on her apron, and sit down at the piano. One Sunday in late September, Lily came bursting through the door with unusual excitement. She was waving her phone around like she'd just won the lottery. "Grandma, Grandma, you won't believe what's happening next month." Margaret looked up from the pot of soup she was stirring. "What's got you so worked up, dear?" "The International Music Festival is coming to the city. Real musicians from all over the world. And they're having open auditions." Lily's eyes were sparkling. Margaret chuckled and went back to her soup. "That's nice, dear. You should go watch. I'm sure it'll be wonderful." "No, Grandma. I don't want to watch." Lily sat down at the kitchen table with a mischievous grin. "I want you to audition." The wooden spoon in Margaret's hand stopped mid-stir. She turned slowly to look at her granddaughter. "Me? Lily, I think that festival is for real musicians. Professional people. Not old ladies who play in their living room. But you are a real musician. You've been playing for over 60 years. You taught piano lessons to half the kids in this town. And that song you wrote, the one about Grandpa, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Margaret's expression softened at the mention of her late husband. Thomas had been gone for 23 years now, but she still thought of him every single day. The song Lily mentioned was something Margaret had composed in the years after he passed. She'd never shown it to anyone except Lily. "Oh, sweetheart, that's just a simple little tune. These festival people want to hear Mozart and Beethoven, played perfectly by young folks who've been to fancy music schools." Lily reached across the table and took her grandmother's hand. "Grandma, you always tell me that music isn't about being perfect. You say it's about feeling, about truth. Remember?" Margaret did remember. She'd said those exact words to dozens of students over the years. But saying it and doing it were two different things. "I don't know, Lily. Please, just think about it." Lily squeezed her hand. "The auditions are open to anyone. And I might have already signed you up. Lily Chen." "You did what?" "Don't be mad. I can cancel it if you really don't want to go." "But Grandma, you have so much to share. The world should hear you play. Not just me and Mr. Whiskers." As if on cue, the orange cat meowed from his spot on the piano. Margaret sighed. She wanted to say no. The whole idea terrified her. But when she looked at Lily's hopeful face, she found herself thinking about something Thomas used to say. "Life's too short to play it safe, Maggie." That's what he'd called her. Maggie. "All right," Margaret heard herself saying. "I'll do it. But I'm not promising anything fancy." Lily jumped up and hugged her grandmother so hard she nearly knocked her over. "You're going to be amazing." "I just know it." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Margaret practiced every day, not just in the mornings anymore. She worked on her original composition, the one about Thomas. She smoothed out the rough parts and added a few new phrases that had come to her in dreams. Lily came over twice to help her pick out something to wear. Margaret didn't own anything fancy. She'd spent most of her life in practical clothes, teaching piano to children and later working at the town library. They finally settled on a simple floral dress that Margaret had worn to church and a cardigan in case the concert hall was cold. The night before the audition, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what on earth she'd gotten herself into. These judges would be professionals, people who knew music inside and out. What would they think of an old woman playing a simple song on an old piano? At 3 in the morning, she got up and went to her piano. She played through her piece one more time in the dark, with only the moonlight coming through the window. Mr. Whiskers appeared and rubbed against her legs. When she finished, she whispered to the cat, "Well, Mr. Whiskers, I suppose we'll find out tomorrow if this old lady's still got it." The next morning, Lily arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. She'd taken the day off work to drive her grandmother to the city. Margaret was already dressed and waiting, her sheet music carefully placed in a folder that she clutched tightly. "You look beautiful, Grandma," Lily said, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "I look old and terrified," Margaret replied, but she smiled anyway. The drive to the city felt both too long and too short. Margaret's stomach was doing flips. She kept glancing at her hands, noticing every age spot, every wrinkle, every slight tremble. These hands had washed dishes, changed diapers, graded homework, planted gardens, and played thousands of songs. But would they be good enough today? When they pulled up to the concert hall, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The building was enormous, all glass and marble and modern architecture. People were streaming in and out, many of them carrying expensive instrument cases. They looked young and confident and professional. "Maybe this was a mistake," Margaret said quietly. Lily put the car in park and turned to her grandmother. "Do you remember what you told me when I was scared to start my first day at the coffee shop? You said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the thing even when you are afraid." Margaret remembered. She'd said a lot of wise things over the years. Now it was time to take her own advice. She opened the car door, stood up on slightly shaky legs, and looked up at the massive concert hall. Somewhere inside that building, someone was going to listen to her play. Maybe they'd like it, maybe they wouldn't, but she'd made a promise to Lily and, more importantly, to herself. "All right then," Margaret said, straightening her cardigan. "Let's go make some music." They walked toward the entrance together, grandmother and granddaughter, neither one knowing that in just a few hours, everything would change. The inside of the concert hall was even more intimidating than the outside. Margaret's sensible shoes clicked on the polished marble floor as she and Lily walked through the massive lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in photographs of famous musicians. People rushed past them carrying violins, cellos, and portfolios stuffed with sheet music. A young woman with a clipboard directed them to the waiting area. It was a large room with rows of chairs, already half filled with people. Margaret noticed immediately that she was by far the oldest person there. Most of the other musicians looked to be in their 20s and 30s. They sat with perfect posture, some with their eyes closed, some running through fingering exercises in the air. "Number 73, the woman with the clipboard said, handing Margaret a sticker. "Pin this somewhere visible. When your number is called, you'll go through those doors." She pointed to a set of heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she stuck the number to her cardigan. Lily squeezed her arm reassuringly and found them 2 seats near the back. They sat down, and Margaret placed her folder of sheet music on her lap. She looked around the room again. Everyone seemed so serious, so prepared. A young man near the front was stretching his fingers and rolling his wrists. A woman with sleek black hair was breathing deeply, like she was meditating. "They all look so professional," Margaret whispered to Lily. "So do you," Lily whispered back. "You've been playing piano since before most of these people were born." But Margaret didn't feel professional. She felt like exactly what she was, an old woman who played piano in her living room for her cat. Numbers were called one by one. Each time someone went through those wooden doors, Margaret's heart beat a little faster. She could hear muffled piano music coming from beyond the doors. Some performances lasted several minutes, others ended abruptly, followed by what sounded like brief, terse conversations. After about 40 minutes, a young man came back through the doors looking close to tears. He walked quickly past everyone and disappeared into the lobby. Margaret felt her stomach drop. If someone that young and talented could be rejected, what chance did she have? "Number 47, a voice called. A woman stood up, smoothed her expensive-looking dress, and walked confidently through the doors. Margaret watched her go and thought about Thomas again. What would he say if he could see her now? Probably something like, "Maggie, you've survived a lot worse than a piano audition." And he'd be right. She'd survived losing him. She'd survived raising 3 kids on her own. She'd survived her house burning down in 1987 and having to rebuild. She'd survived pneumonia, a car accident, and the death of her oldest son 5 years ago. Surely she could survive playing one song for a few strangers. But as the numbers climbed higher, Margaret's confidence wavered. Number 53, number 61, number 68. Finally, the voice called out, "Number 73. Margaret stood up so quickly she nearly dropped her sheet music. Lily stood with her. "I can't go in with you, Grandma, but I'll be right here waiting." "You've got this." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She walked toward the wooden doors on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. A young man opened the door for her and she stepped through. The auditorium was breathtaking. Row upon row of red velvet seats stretched back into darkness. The stage was lit by bright spotlights, and in the center sat a beautiful grand piano, black and gleaming. Margaret had never played a piano that nice in her entire life, but it wasn't the piano that made her pause. It was the three people sitting in the front row. In the middle sat a man who looked to be in his 60s. He had silver hair, sharp features, and was wearing an expensive-looking suit. Even from the stage, Margaret could see the impatience in his posture. His arms were crossed, and he was leaning back in his seat like he'd already decided this was a waste of his time. To his left sat a younger woman with glasses, busily writing notes on a tablet. To his right was an older gentleman who looked slightly more friendly, but not by much. "Name?" The silver-haired man called out. His accent was thick, Eastern European maybe. "Margaret Chen," she said, her voice sounding small in the huge space. The man glanced at a list in front of him. Margaret Chen, age 78. No formal conservatory training. "Is this correct?" "Yes, sir." "That's correct." Margaret saw him exchange a look with the woman to his left. The woman's lips twitched like she was trying not to smile. Or maybe trying not to laugh. The silver-haired man sighed. "And what will you be playing for us today, Mrs. Chen?" "It's an original composition, sir. Something I wrote myself. It's called Thomas's Song." This time the man didn't bother to hide his reaction. He smiled, not a kind smile. The sort of smile someone makes when they find something amusing in a pitying way. "An original composition," he repeated, like the words themselves were funny. He turned to the older gentleman next to him and said something in a language Margaret didn't understand. The other man chuckled softly. Margaret felt heat rising to her cheeks. She'd expected to be nervous, but she hadn't expected to be laughed at before she even played a single note. The silver-haired man waved his hand dismissively. "Very well. Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Chen. Though I must tell you, we have many, many more auditions today. So please let us not waste time, yes?" His words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret stood there for a moment, frozen. In the audience behind the three judges, she could see other people. Maybe assistants or other festival organizers. A few of them had their phones out. Were they recording this? Were they expecting her to fail? To be the funny old lady who thought she could play at a real music festival? Margaret looked down at the folder in her hands. Inside was the song she'd written for Thomas. The song that came from the deepest part of her heart. The song that helped her survive the loneliest nights after he died. That song wasn't a joke. Her love for Thomas wasn't a joke. She walked to the piano bench, her practical shoes clicking against the stage floor. Each step felt heavy. She could feel all those eyes on her. Judging her age, her clothes, her simple folder of sheet music, her trembling hands. The piano bench was different from her old one at home. She had to adjust it, twisting the knob to lower it a bit. Her fingers fumbled with it, and she heard someone in the audience whisper something. Someone else laughed softly. The silver-haired man looked at his watch. An actual watch check, like she was already taking too long and she hadn't even started. Margaret finally got the bench adjusted and sat down. She placed her sheet music on the stand, though she didn't really need it. She'd played this song so many times she knew every note by heart. Her hands moved to the keys but didn't press down yet. She closed her eyes and thought about Thomas. About the day they met at a church social. About their wedding day. About the way he used to dance with her in the kitchen while dinner was cooking. About the letters he sent during the war. About the day she got the news that he wasn't coming home. Behind her, she heard the silver-haired man sigh again. "Mrs. Chen, whenever you are ready," he said. His tone made it clear what he really meant. "Whenever you are ready to stop wasting our time." Margaret took a deep breath. Her fingers were still trembling, but she placed them on the keys anyway, and then she began to play. The first note rang out clear and pure in the silent auditorium. Then the second, then the third. The melody started simple, quiet, like a whisper. Margaret forgot about the judges. She forgot about the people with their phones. She forgot about being laughed at. She was back in her living room. Back with Thomas. Back in the only place that mattered. The music filled the space, note by note, building into something bigger than Margaret had ever played it before. This wasn't her old upright piano at home. This grand piano had a richness, a depth that brought new life to her simple melody. And somewhere in the front row, the silver-haired man's smile began to fade. The melody started softly, like morning light creeping through curtains. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that came from decades of practice. This wasn't the flashy, aggressive playing that usually impressed judges. There were no dramatic runs up and down the keyboard. No thundering crescendos meant to make people gasp. This was different. This was honest. The song told a story. It started with the simple happiness of two young people falling in love. The notes danced playfully, like Thomas had danced with her at that church social all those years ago. Margaret remembered the blue dress she'd worn, the way he'd stepped on her toes twice and apologized both times, the way they'd laughed together. In the front row, the silver-haired man uncrossed his arms. His expression hadn't changed yet, but something in his posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly, just an inch or two. The woman with the tablet stopped writing and looked up at the stage. Margaret didn't notice. Her eyes were closed now. She was deep inside the music, inside the memories that had shaped this composition. Her fingers moved to a different section, and the melody changed. It became fuller, richer. This was the part about building a life together. About their tiny first apartment. About Thomas working 2 jobs so they could save for a house. About the day they brought their first baby home from the hospital. The notes swirled together, sometimes happy, sometimes challenging, but always moving forward. Always together. That's what marriage had been like. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth it. Behind the judges, one of the assistants who'd been scrolling on her phone stopped and looked up. Another person who'd been whispering to a colleague fell silent. The music was doing something unexpected. It was demanding to be heard. Margaret's hands moved to the middle section of the piano and the tone changed again. This part was harder for her to play, not technically, but emotionally. This was the war. This was Thomas leaving. The notes became sparse, separated by silence. Each note felt alone, the way Margaret had felt reading his letters, waiting for him to come home, taking care of 3 small children by herself. The silver-haired man's jaw tightened. His eyes were fixed on Margaret's hands, watching them move across the keys. The older gentleman beside him had stopped looking at his papers entirely. He was staring at Margaret with an expression of surprise, like he'd expected to hear one thing and was hearing something completely different. The sparse, lonely notes continued. Days without letters, weeks of worry, and then, without warning, Margaret's hands crashed down on the lower keys. Not loudly, but heavily. Final. This was the news. The telegram. The uniformed officer at her door. The words that changed everything. "We regret to inform you." A few people in the audience caught their breath. The music had struck something deep, something universal. Everyone in that room had lost someone. Everyone knew what grief felt like. Margaret's fingers trembled on the keys, but she kept playing. This was the part she'd written in the darkest days after Thomas died, when the house felt too empty, when his chair at the dinner table seemed to mock her, when she had to be strong for the children even though she felt broken inside. The melody became fragmented, searching. The notes asked questions that had no answers. Why him? Why so young? Why, when they'd had so many plans, so many dreams still waiting to come true? The silver-haired man's face had changed completely now. The smirk was gone. The impatience had vanished. His eyes were glistening. He blinked rapidly, like he was trying to fight against something he didn't want to feel. But Margaret wasn't finished with her story. Her hands moved higher on the keyboard again, and slowly, painfully, the melody began to find hope. Not the easy, shallow kind of hope. The hard-won kind. The kind that comes from getting up every morning even when you don't want to. From making breakfast for your children even though your heart is shattered. From choosing to keep living even though part of you died with the person you lost. The notes grew stronger. They found a rhythm, a steadiness. This was Margaret learning to survive. teaching piano lessons to neighborhood children for spare change, working at the library, watching her own children grow up, graduate, get married, becoming a grandmother, finding joy again in small, unexpected moments. The woman with the tablet had tears rolling down her cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe them away. The older gentleman beside the silver-haired man had pulled out a handkerchief and was pressing it to his eyes. And the silver-haired man, the famous Maestro Victor Petrov, who had made concert pianists cry with his harsh critiques, who was known throughout the music world for his impossibly high standards and cutting remarks, sat perfectly still with tears streaming down his face. Margaret's hands danced across the keys now, building to the final section of her composition. This was the part about memory, about carrying Thomas with her in everything she did. He was there when she taught children to play their first scales. He was there when she played hymns at church. He was there in the garden she tended, in the photographs on her mantel, in the stories she told her grandchildren. The melody wove together all the previous themes. The love, the loss, the grief, the survival, the hope. They were all part of the same story, all threads in the same tapestry. You couldn't have one without the others. The joy meant something because of the sorrow. The love meant something because it had been real, because it had cost something. The music swelled, not loud but full. Every note mattered. Every pause had meaning. This wasn't about showing off technical skill. This was about truth, about a real life really lived, about loving someone so much that losing them nearly destroyed you, but their memory gave you the strength to keep going. In the audience, more people were crying now. Even those who'd been cynical, who'd had their phones out ready to record a silly old lady making a fool of herself, had put their devices away. Some of them were thinking about their own losses, their own grandparents, their own loves, their own griefs. Margaret played the final measures. Her fingers pressed the keys with such tenderness, such care. The melody resolved itself not with a triumphant ending but with quiet acceptance. This was life, beautiful and terrible and precious, and music, real music, could capture that truth in a way that words never could. The last note rang out in the silent auditorium. It hung in the air, pure and clear, then slowly faded away. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She opened her eyes and took a deep breath. For a moment she'd forgotten where she was. She'd been so lost in the music and the memories that the concert hall had disappeared. Now it came rushing back. The bright stage lights, the rows of empty seats stretching into darkness, the three judges in the front row, the complete and total silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Margaret sat frozen on the piano bench, suddenly terrified. Had it been that bad? Had she made some terrible mistake? Maybe the judges were silent because they were trying to figure out how to politely tell her to leave. She turned slightly on the bench to look at them, preparing herself for rejection, for dismissal, for that same mocking smile she'd seen before she started playing. But what she saw made her heart stop. Victor Petrov, the silver-haired maestro who had laughed at her just minutes ago, was standing up. His face was wet with tears. His expression was completely transformed. He wasn't looking at her with mockery anymore. He wasn't looking at her with impatience or dismissal. He was looking at her with something like reverence. And then, without saying a word, he started walking toward the stage. His footsteps echoed in the silent auditorium. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, each one deliberate, purposeful. Margaret's mind raced. Was he angry? Was he going to scold her? Tell her she had no business being here? Victor reached the stairs leading up to the stage. He climbed them slowly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The woman with the tablet and the older gentleman watched in stunned silence. This wasn't normal procedure. This wasn't how auditions worked. Victor walked across the stage, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished wood. He stopped right in front of the piano, right in front of Margaret. And then he did something that made everyone in the auditorium gasp. He knelt down. Victor Petrov knelt down beside the piano bench, his expensive suit wrinkling against the stage floor. He reached out and took Margaret's weathered hand in both of his. His hands were shaking. "Forgive me," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please forgive me." Margaret stared at him in complete confusion. This powerful, intimidating man who had laughed at her was now on his knees, tears still fresh on his face. She didn't understand what was happening. I'm not sure what you mean, sir, she said softly. Victor looked up at her, and in his eyes, Margaret saw something she hadn't expected. Shame. Deep, genuine shame. I judged you before you played a single note, he said. I saw your age, your simple clothes, your homemade sheet music, and I decided you were not worth my time. I was cruel. I was arrogant. And I was so wrong. He stood up slowly, still holding her hand, and turned to face the mostly empty auditorium. His voice grew stronger, addressing everyone in the room. I have spent 30 years of my life in the finest concert halls in the world. I have heard performances by pianists who trained at Juilliard, at the Moscow Conservatory, at the Royal Academy. I have heard pieces played with perfect technical precision. Not one wrong note. Not one missed tempo. Perfect. He paused, and his grip on Margaret's hand tightened slightly. And do you know what? Most of those perfect performances meant nothing. They were empty. Beautiful shells with nothing inside. The notes were right, but the heart was missing. Victor turned back to Margaret, and now he was smiling. Not the mocking smile from before. A real smile full of warmth and respect. What you just played, Mrs. Chen, that was not perfect. Your tempo wavered in places. Some of the transitions were simple, almost plain. But what you played had something that cannot be taught in any music school. It had soul. It had truth. It had lived experience poured into every single note. Margaret felt her own eyes filling with tears now. She'd spent so many years thinking she was just an amateur. Just an old lady playing in her living room. She'd never imagined that her simple song could move someone like this. The woman with the tablet stood up from her seat in the front row. She was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Victor is right, she called out. I've been judging auditions for this festival for 8 years. That was the most honest performance I've ever heard. The older gentleman stood as well, nodding in agreement. Extraordinary. Simply extraordinary. Victor finally released Margaret's hand and stepped back. Tell me about Thomas, he said gently. Tell me about the man who inspired this music. And so Margaret did. Sitting there on the stage in front of these strangers, she told them about meeting Thomas at that church social. About their life together, about the 3 children they raised, about his letters from the war, about the day the officer came to her door, about the years of grief and healing that followed. As she spoke, more people began appearing in the auditorium. The doors at the back opened, and the musicians who were still waiting for their audition started filing in. Word had spread somehow. Something special was happening on that stage, and they wanted to witness it. Lily pushed through the growing crowd and ran down the aisle. Grandma, she called out, her voice echoing through the space. Margaret looked up and saw her granddaughter rushing toward the stage, her face glowing with pride and joy. Victor noticed and gestured for her to come up. This is your granddaughter? He asked Margaret. Yes, sir. This is Lily. She's the one who made me come here today. I almost didn't. Victor turned to Lily as she climbed the stage stairs. Then we owe you a debt of gratitude, young lady. Your grandmother has reminded me of something I had forgotten, something crucial. What's that? Lily asked, standing protectively beside her grandmother. That music is not about impressing people. It is not about winning competitions or earning applause. Music is about connecting one human heart to another. It is about shared experience, shared emotion, shared humanity. He looked around at the crowd that had gathered. There were maybe 50 people now, all watching, all listening. Some of them were the same musicians who had whispered and laughed when Margaret walked to the stage. Now they looked ashamed of themselves. Victor raised his voice so everyone could hear. I have made a career of judging musicians by their technique, their training, their credentials. I have been harsh with people who came before me with hope in their hearts. I told myself I was maintaining standards, preserving excellence. But what I was really doing was forgetting why any of us fell in love with music in the first place. He turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Chen, I came to this audition today as a judge. But you have taught me something. You have been the teacher and I have been the student. Margaret shook her head modestly. I'm just an old woman who plays piano, sir. I'm nothing special. No, Victor said firmly. You are something very special indeed. And I would like to ask you something. He paused, glancing at the other 2 judges who both nodded enthusiastically. The International Music Festival closes with a special performance in 4 weeks. We typically invite one of the established musicians, someone with a famous name, to perform. But this year I would like to do something different. Mrs. Chen, would you honor us by performing your composition at our closing ceremony? Margaret's mouth fell open. Me, perform at the festival? But I'm not. You are exactly what we need, Victor interrupted gently. You are what this festival needs. What I need. A reminder that music at its best is not about perfection. It is about truth. Lily squeezed her grandmother's shoulder. Say yes, Grandma. Please say yes. Margaret looked around the stage, at Victor with his tear-stained face, at the other judges nodding encouragement, at her granddaughter beaming with pride, at the crowd of musicians watching her with newfound respect. She thought about Thomas again, about what he would say, and she knew. He'd tell her to do it. He'd tell her that she'd come this far, she might as well see it through. All right, Margaret said, her voice stronger now. Yes, I'll do it. The auditorium erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause. Real, heartfelt applause. People were clapping and cheering. Some were wiping away tears. The musicians who had dismissed her before were now applauding the hardest, perhaps trying to make up for their earlier judgment. Victor shook her hand warmly. We will provide whatever you need. A rehearsal space, time on the stage to practice. Anything at all. I don't need much, Margaret said with a small smile. Just a piano and a quiet place to remember. The woman with the tablet came up onto the stage and hugged Margaret. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for reminding us what matters. As the crowd began to disperse, people came up to shake Margaret's hand or tell her how moved they were by her performance. Young musicians, some who had laughed at her earlier, now approached with sheepish expressions. One young man, who couldn't have been more than 25, waited until most of the crowd had left before approaching. Mrs. Chen, he said nervously, I was one of the people who laughed when you first came on stage. I'm so sorry. I judged you and I was wrong. Margaret smiled at him kindly. We all make mistakes, dear. The important thing is learning from them. Your piece, he continued. It made me think about my own grandmother. She passed away last year. I never got to tell her how much she meant to me. But hearing your music, it felt like I got to say goodbye somehow. He was crying now, and Margaret stood up from the piano bench and hugged him. This tall young man bent down to embrace this small old woman, and they stood there for a moment, two strangers connected by music and loss and memory. When they finally pulled apart, the young man wiped his eyes. I hope when I'm your age I can play something half as meaningful as what you played today. You will, Margaret assured him. Just remember that the notes on the page are only part of the story. The real music comes from here. She placed her hand over her heart. Victor approached as the young man walked away. Mrs. Chen, one more thing. I would like to record your performance at the festival. With your permission, of course. I think the world should hear what you have to say through your music. Margaret thought about that. The world. It seemed impossible. But then again, this entire day had seemed impossible. Yes, she said. If you think it would help people, then yes. Victor smiled. It will help people more than you know. As Margaret and Lily finally left the auditorium, walking back through those wooden doors into the waiting area, the remaining musicians stood up and applauded. These people who were waiting for their own auditions, who should have been focused on their own performances, stopped everything to honor this elderly woman who had shown them what music could really be. Outside in the parking lot, Lily hugged her grandmother tight. I'm so proud of you, Grandma. So proud. Margaret hugged her back, feeling overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I still can't believe it. Did that really just happen? It really did. And Grandma, I need to tell you something. And what's that, dear? I recorded your performance on my phone. I hope that's okay. I wanted to remember it forever. Margaret laughed. Well, I suppose now Mr. Whiskers isn't the only one who's heard me play. They got in the car, and as Lily started driving back toward their small town, Margaret looked out the window at the city passing by. Somewhere in that concert hall, Victor Petrov was probably still thinking about the song she'd played. The song about Thomas. The song about love and loss and surviving. She'd come here today expecting nothing. Maybe expecting to fail. Certainly not expecting to teach a famous maestro a lesson about music and life. But life, Margaret had learned long ago, was full of surprises. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to show up and be yourself, something beautiful could happen. The 4 weeks leading up to the festival closing ceremony passed in a blur. Margaret's quiet life on Maple Street suddenly became very busy. Victor called her personally 3 times to check if she needed anything. The festival organizers sent a car to pick her up for rehearsals, and somehow word about her audition had spread through the local community. The first sign was when Margaret went to the grocery store, the day after her audition. Mrs. Patterson, from the church choir, stopped her in the produce section. "Margaret Chen, I heard what happened at that music festival. The whole town is talking about it." Margaret blushed, holding a bag of apples. "Oh, it wasn't that big of a deal." "Not a big deal? You made a famous Maestro cry. That young man who delivers my mail, his cousin was at the audition. He told everyone." By the end of the week, Margaret couldn't walk down Main Street without people congratulating her. The librarian where she used to work hung a sign in the window that read, "Proud of our own Margaret Chen." Her neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. Her phone rang constantly with old students calling to tell her they'd always known she was special. Lily came over every evening to help her grandmother prepare. They talked about what she should wear, how she should do her hair, whether she should memorize the piece or use her sheet music. "What if I forget the notes in front of all those people?" Margaret worried one evening, sitting at her old piano with Mr. Whiskers purring beside her. "Grandma, you've played this song 1,000 times. Your hands know it by heart. You won't forget. But this is different. The audition was one thing. But a whole concert? With hundreds of people watching?" Lily knelt beside the piano bench and took her grandmother's hands. "You know what Victor said? Music is about connecting hearts. You're not performing for those people. You're sharing something with them." "There's a difference," Margaret nodded slowly. Lily was right, but the fear was still there, sitting heavy in her chest. The night before the closing ceremony, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, just like she had before the audition. But this time something felt different. She got up, wrapped her robe around herself, and walked to the living room. The piano sat there in the moonlight, just like it had for 52 years. She sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't play Thomas's song. Instead, she played the first piece she'd ever learned as a little girl. A simple melody her own grandmother had taught her. As she played, she thought about all the hands that had touched piano keys before her. Her grandmother's hands, her mother's hands, all the students she'd taught over the years, and Thomas's hands, though he'd never been musical. He used to sit and listen to her play after dinner, his hands folded in his lap, that peaceful smile on his face. Music wasn't just about the person playing. It was about everyone who had ever loved a song, ever been moved by a melody, ever found comfort in the sound of an instrument. She wasn't going to that festival tomorrow as Margaret Chen, the amateur. She was going as part of something bigger, a long line of people who played music not for fame or money, but because it fed their souls. "I'm ready," she whispered to the empty room, to Thomas, to herself. The next evening, Lily picked her up at 5 o'clock. Margaret wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress that they'd found at a department store. Her white hair was styled nicely, and she'd put on the pearl earrings Thomas had given her on their 20th anniversary. "You look beautiful." "Grandma," Lily said, her eyes shining with pride. The concert hall was transformed. The last time Margaret had been here, it had been mostly empty. Now, as they pulled up, she could see crowds of people streaming through the doors. The marquee outside read International Music Festival Closing Ceremony and listed several performers. At the very end, it said, "Special performance by Margaret Chen." Margaret's stomach flipped. "Oh my, there are so many people. They're here to experience something special," Lily said. "And you're going to give them that." Inside, a young woman with a headset led Margaret backstage. The area was buzzing with activity. Musicians warming up, technicians checking equipment, people rushing back and forth with clipboards. It was controlled chaos. Victor found her almost immediately. He looked distinguished in his formal conductor's attire, but his face was warm and welcoming. "Mrs. Chen, you made it. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted with a nervous laugh. Victor smiled. "Good, that means you care. The day you stop being nervous before a performance is the day you should stop performing." He led her to a quiet room where she could wait until it was her turn. "You're the final performance of the evening," he explained. "After the other pieces, I will speak briefly, and then I will introduce you." "What will you say?" Margaret asked. "The truth, that you reminded me what music is really about." Margaret sat in that quiet room for what felt like hours. She could hear muffled music from the stage, applause, more music, more applause. Each piece performed was by a trained musician, someone with credentials and experience. What was she doing here among them? Finally, there was a knock on the door. "Mrs. Chen, 5 minutes." Lily hugged her tight. "Remember, you're just sharing." "That's all. Sharing Thomas's story." Margaret nodded and walked toward the stage entrance. She could hear Victor speaking to the audience. "Before we close this evening," his voice carried through the speakers, "I want to tell you about something that happened 4 weeks ago. An elderly woman came to our auditions. When she walked on stage, I laughed. I was impatient. I had decided before hearing a single note that she was wasting my time." Margaret could hear how quiet the audience had become, but then she played. And what she played changed me. It reminded me of why I fell in love with music when I was a young boy in St. Petersburg. Not because of technique or precision, but because music can carry the weight of a human life. It can tell stories that words cannot tell. It can connect us to each other in the deepest possible way. Margaret stood in the wings listening. Tonight we close this festival not with a famous name but with a truth-teller, not with perfection but with authenticity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Margaret Chen. The applause was thunderous. Margaret walked onto the stage, her legs steadier than she expected. The audience was a sea of faces, hundreds of people. The lights were bright but not blinding. She could see Lily in the front row, wiping away tears already. Margaret sat at the piano. The same beautiful grand piano from the audition. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas. Always Thomas. And then she began to play. The music flowed from her fingers like it never had before. Maybe it was the acoustics of the full auditorium. Maybe it was the energy of all those people listening. Or maybe it was simply that Margaret had finally accepted what Victor had been trying to tell her. She wasn't an amateur. She was a musician. Not because of training or credentials, but because she had something to say, and music was how she said it. She played through the entire piece, every memory, every emotion, every truth she'd lived. When she reached the final notes, she held them longer than usual, letting them resonate through the space. The last note faded into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Complete stillness. Then the entire audience rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. People were crying, hugging each other, calling out. Margaret opened her eyes and saw Victor in the wings, tears streaming down his face again, applauding harder than anyone. She stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Finally, Victor walked onto the stage and took her hand, raising it high. "This," he said to the audience, though there was no microphone near him, "this is music." After the ceremony, dozens of people wanted to talk to Margaret. Other musicians thanked her. Audience members told her about their own losses, their own loves. A young woman told her she was going to call her grandmother that night, something she'd been putting off. A reporter asked if she'd ever considered recording an album. Margaret laughed. "I'm 78 years old. I think that ship has sailed." "I disagree," Victor said, appearing beside her. "I think that ship is just leaving the harbor." Over the following months, Margaret's life did change, but not in the ways she'd expected. She didn't become famous, not really. But Victor kept his word about recording her performance. He shared it with his colleagues in the music world. It was played on classical radio stations. A video of her audition performance, the one Lily had recorded, was shared online and viewed by millions. But Margaret didn't pay much attention to any of that. She went back to her house on Maple Street to her old piano and Mr. Whiskers. She still played every morning with her tea. She still taught the occasional piano lesson to neighborhood children, though now they looked at her with a bit more awe. The biggest change was in how Victor Petrov approached his own work. He began advocating for music education in schools. He started a program to help amateur musicians share their work. And whenever he judged auditions or competitions, he always remembered the lesson Margaret had taught him. Don't judge the musician before they play. Listen first, because sometimes the most profound music comes from the most unexpected places. Margaret kept a photo on her mantle from the closing ceremony. In it, she's standing at the piano, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music. Beside it is an old photo of Thomas in his uniform, smiling at the camera. Sometimes when the morning light hit the photos just right, Margaret would smile and say, "We did it, Thomas. We told our story," and in a way they had. Not just their story, but a story that belonged to everyone who'd ever loved and lost, survived and hoped, lived and remembered. That's what music does. It takes one person's truth and makes it universal. It reminds us that we're all connected by the same joys and sorrows, the same beautiful, terrible, precious experience of being human. Margaret Chen understood that now. She'd always understood it, really. She just hadn't realized that understanding was enough. More than enough, it was everything.